Let me tell you the fundamental differences principle between Islamic banking and conventional banking. The functions and operation modes of Islamic banks are based on the Islamic Sharia. Sharia is a law that represents a divinely ordained path of conduct that guides Muslims towards the practical expressions of religious convictions in this world and the goal of divine favor in the world to come. It categorizes all men's acts into 5 distinct categories: obligatory, recommended, permitted, discouraged, and forbidden. Meanwhile, the functions and operating modes of conventional banks are based on fairly man-made principles. Safety, liquidity, purpose, profitability are some of the principles that must be followed to mitigate risks like loss and fraudulency.
Firstly, without interest-based transaction versus with interest-based transaction, riba. In Islamic bank, use murabahah that governs the issuing of home loans or any other type of goods needed by a borrower. A contract of sale between the bank and its client for the sale of goods at a price plus an agreed profit margin for the bank. The contract involves the purchase of goods by the bank, which then sell to them to the client at an agreed markup. Repayment is usually in an installment. However, conventional banks use interest-based transactions, which are an additional money that you pay to lender as a cost of borrowing money. Second, economic activities without involving operation versus profit maximization at the expenses of ethical condition. In Islamic bank, aims at maximizing profit but subject to restriction. In case of late payment, it has no provision to charge any extra money from the defaulters. However, only small amount of compensation are required and this proceeds is given to charity. Moreover, rebates are given for early settlement at the bank discretion. Meanwhile, the conventional bank aims at maximizing profit without any restriction. It can charge additional money, penalty, and compounded interest in case of defaulters. Transactions of goods and services with restriction versus transactions of goods and services without restrictions. For the Islamic bank, it must be based on Shariah-approved underlying transaction. Some of the requirements for Shariah-compliant fund include the exclusion of investment, which derive a majority of their income from the sale of alcohol or product, pornography, gambling, military equipment, or weapons. Meanwhile, for interest-based commercial banks, borrowing from the money market is relatively easier. It does not consider any transactions that involve anything that contradicts the Islamic value, which is haram. With Islamic tax versus without Islamic tax. Zakat is giving away a certain type of property at a certain rate in accordance with certain conditions to be distributed to certain groups of people. In the modern Islamic banking system, it has become one of the service-oriented functions of the Islamic banks to be a zakat collection center, and they also pay out their zakat. However, conventional bank does not deal with zakat.
Let's talk about how these principles reflect ethical and professional conduct in financial dealings. The principles of Islamic banking can maintain the integrity, meaning that it guarantees that financial transactions should be free from fraud. For example, Islamic banks are Sharia-compliant financial institutions where all the transactions are subjected to Sharia restriction. These principles also guarantees that each and every individual in financial institutions is treated fairly to avoid conflict of interest. Islamic banks promote risk sharing between providers of capital, the investor, and the user of funds, the entrepreneur.
Accountability. Responsibility for one transactional behavior, for example, accepting responsibility for choice and correcting mistake if it's happened by fixing it right away. Since it share profit and loss, the Islamic banks pay greater attention to developing project to appraisal and evaluation. Islamic banks also responsible for losses that occur. Next, professional competence. In order to ensure accurate and legal producers, professionals need to stay up to date on financial standards and regulations. With this, any economic activities involving speculation or uncertainty, borrower can be avoided.
Lastly, compliance with law and regulation reflection in conduct. Following legal standards reflect both ethical and professional conduct, ensuring their organization avoid penalties or reputational harm. For instance, filing tax accurately and on time demonstrate adherence to financial regulation. Lastly, all of this can be found in banks that are Shariah compliant. For instance, Maybank Islami, Affin Islamic Bank, NS. Meanwhile, this practice cannot be found in conventional banks such as FM Bank, Malaysia Banking.